Hello everyone, this is Peak Entertainment and we are back again, and here now we have another video for you, and this will be a full-on spoiler review of Masters of the Universe Revelation Part 1. Now you can check out my non-spoiler review of the series, and I'll leave the link within the description and also at the end title credit of this video. Now in that review I commented on the amazing animation and visuals of the show, but I highlighted the flaws and the rushed story plot points. And that was coming from a neutral perspective, because I said there was 3 points of view, coming from a view where you don't know anything about the property, not really invested in it, you just want this as to be a new show. The second point of view is being invested a lot more from the online drama and the perception of the show, and I will talk about it later on throughout this review. And the third one is from the perspective of someone who is a fan of the franchise and did grow up watching it when they were very young as part of those Saturday morning cartoons revolutions at the time. So this spoiler review will be a perspective from my point of view as someone who grew up on the 80s original series, has a strong idea of what the franchise is and what the characters stand for. So this will be a free discussion, and so I'll point out some of the main issues I felt in terms of the characters and where they took them in this overall story. And yes, I will also comment on the elements of the series and whether they confirmed or not all of the speculation surrounding the drama online, and whether this was indeed a Tina-led show, and how much identity politics or social agendas were throughout the series. So we will cover all of that within this video as well, so I'll be as concise as I can. So the first point that I highlighted was at the beginning of the episode, where we started with the ongoing battle between Sorceress protecting Grayskull from the oncoming forces of Skeletor. Now in the beginning she takes on 2 hostages, and we see He-Man coming forward on the horse in the cloak as well, and then it turns out to be Fixer, and he tries to capture Sorceress, and yet Sorceress finds out who she is, and then that's when she comes under the forces of the attack. And I just really picked out more. Sorceress surely would have known that it wasn't He-Man, right? Because the majority of interpretations, and in this version as well, Sorceress always summons He-Man, so she always knows where he is and what he's up to, right? Whether he's He-Man or Adam for the most part. So it was just a bit of a nitpick for me that why she didn't realise that Faker was indeed not He-Man himself. As my non-spoiler review, we did get the epic set pieces and action that we were looking for throughout this series, and looking back, I just wish this whole arc was lengthened. You know, there was so much they could have done in building towards this whole attack on Grayskull. How exactly did Skeletor put that plan together with Faker involved as well? Why was Grayskull so unprotected in many ways? You know, it seemed almost too easy to infiltrate Grayskull, and Skeletor even alluded to this during the beginning part of the episode. And that was the section where I felt this was the He-Man series I think that I wanted, and a lot of fans wanted. You know, that epic spectacle, that serious fantasy tone that we all wanted to see. I loved the initial transformation sequence that we saw at the beginning from Adam when he evacuates everybody from the throne room. That was great to see, and then he transforms Cringer as well. Fantastic. Again, just all of those high scale moments that we get from the He-Man storyline overall. Fantastic overall. And we see Skeletor's forces attacking Grayskull, and I was loving it at this stage. I thought this is the He-Man that we wanted. He-Man looked like an absolute beast. Maybe if you want to read critical proportion wise, maybe he was a bit too large at times. He was borderline a human Hulk when you look at him in comparison to other characters. Where we compared to the 80s version, yes, he was big and muscular, but it was much more restrained in terms of his overall size and proportions. And even the 2002 reboot as well scaled it down a little bit, but it wasn't distracting overall, I think, if you get used to it. And I did like the style of the Powerhouse animation, the way that they drew the certain characters, so that was great as well. So I had no issues in terms of the way that the characters were visualized on the particular screen. But as I mentioned before, this whole sequence of play really should have been an episodic arc, and I would have left it as a actual season finale, where indeed we see the splitting of the swords and He-Man separated from Adam. You know, we look back on the 2002 reboot, and that did it so much better. We had at least 2 or 3 multiple arcs where we see Grayskull coming under attack, but they built it up a lot better. There was 2 episodes where they really ramped up the motivations behind the character and the plans and the strategies, so it added a lot more weight and tension and suspense when we got to the big large scale action sequences, and this series could have learnt from that overall. Now we go on to the third point. Now I do feel that He-Man was perhaps beaten a bit too easily. There's that sequence where we see them fighting, and it just seemed like He-Man wasn't quite as powerful as what I thought he was. Now, we come to the next bit where we see one of the many character deaths throughout the show. I think there's overall 3 deaths, maybe 4, throughout this series. And it depends on where you are, because obviously one of the primary objectives of the 80s version is that there was no killing, right? I think there was also a rule where they didn't have really any character punch or strike another one down, if I remember correctly overall, but there was no killing. And obviously, along with the strong moral fabric that came along with the 80s show, again, this is a problem because they are saying that this is a sequel and a continuation of that version, so you'd like to think they would maintain that moral compass, if you like, throughout this version, but they don't. No, there's at least 3 character deaths, as I mentioned before, and there's a couple of stabbings and killings. It's not super R-rated as what you would associate with a normal anime show, but again, you may just want to be wary of it if you are making your young kids watching it. It's not particularly graphic, but again, it just depends on the tolerance level that you set for your children when watching these particular shows. But Skeletor kills Mossman. He sets him on fire. I thought that was a bit of a shocking moment at the time, ramping up the tension. And then He-Man, in a rage, stabs Skeletor, and from that he opens the key to the Hall of Wisdom. So again, that was a bit convenient that he stabs him and also manages to fit the sword in exactly the right place, which opens the Hall of Wisdom. And again, if the show was developing its ideas and much more, and we were prolonging this, they could have found a much more, I think, credible way in order for Skeletor to find the keys to opening the Halls of Wisdom. Now, in terms of the concept of the Halls of Wisdom, it turns out that it was protecting a orb that contained all of the magic within Eternia, and it basically, Castle Grayskull wasn't actually Castle Grayskull. It was actually a camouflage to hide the Halls of Wisdom. Now, I didn't like that. I think you're taking away one of the most iconic locations within all of the He-Man franchise, Castle Grayskull itself. So just to diminish it more as just a screen of camouflage to protecting the Halls of Wisdom, I didn't like that idea. I think they made a bad decision there. And I do believe the 2002 reboot had the Halls of Wisdom separate from the Castle Grayskull, and I think they should have adopted that approach for this series as well. There was also the concept that the fact that when Skeletor cracks the orb, it basically could end all of Eternia, not all of Eternia, all of the universe. And again, that's such a speculative event that in an ideal world, you'd want a lot more development to it. It just seems that the show was just throwing all of these big ideas and concepts and just really whizzing through them all. They wanted to amp up the high stakes, I understand that, but that was just a bit of a stretch from a logical point of view. And also Sorceress, we see her where she freezes time as Skeletor cracks the orb, just to kind of warn He-Man and Teela what's going to happen if they don't prevent this or stop this overall. So you think again, if Sorceress has the ability to freeze time, why couldn't she have foreseen the current events? I think actually Teela asks her a similar question to that, and Sorceress states that she wanted to see Teela for the last time. So again, if you're being super nitpicky about that, but again, it was great visuals. I love the orb effect. And again, as I mentioned before, multiple times, that great visual shot where we see He-Man splitting the sword, fantastic scene, in order to contain the blast and take away the energy. And we get the concepts that the two sides of the swords will be split into Preternia and Subternia as well. Again, would have been far more dramatic if we had this at the end of the series. And then we would get in the revelations where we see Teela, amidst all the blast, she sees the identities of Cringer as Battle Cat, and of course, more importantly, He-Man as Prince Adam. Skeletor sees that as well. So great climatic event. Loved all the music and the action as well. So the next contention point, I think, for a lot of fans, and I think this is one of the biggest contention points for me, when we're dealing with the fallout of the revelations that we see Teela discovering who Prince Adam was, we go back to the palace, and it's brought to the attention who people were overall. Man-at-Arms admits to King Randall that he knew who He-Man was, and we see that Queen Melina knew who Adam's identity was. Like, how did she know that? Like, that was really out of the blue, and they didn't do anything to further develop that. That would have been a really interesting development and a discussion between Queen Melina and King Randall as to how exactly she knew who Adam was, and she never told King Randall. And then we get to the abruptness that I mentioned in my non-spoiler review, where King Randall, all of a sudden, once he discovers who the identity was, and obviously that Adam died along with He-Man, he cast Man-at-Arms aside, basically denouncing him from his rank and threatening him with execution if he ever returns back to the palace. Now, this really felt out of character of King Randall. I understand, yes, he just lost his son, and in that moment of grief, I get it, but in most iterations, and again, you're saying this is a continuation of the 80s version, Man-at-Arms is the loyal advisor of King Randall. He was the one that fought alongside King Randall when they were both soldiers at the time. So he trusts Man-at-Arms fully. So I can understand there was a bit of disagreement, but again, I'd like to see if there was a further reconciliation, not to just cast Man-at-Arms out like that and also threaten him with execution. That felt really out of character. And then we continue that tone with Teela as well, basically throwing a tantrum that she didn't know, and then that's when she puts her tiara down and walks away from the palace. And again, this is one of the main issues that I had with Teela as a character, and I think a lot of people have, is that she was just too temperamental. Okay, they lied to you, they betrayed you, but you think if you would just rationalise it and understand why Adam, it was so important that he kept He-Man's identity for you, it was to protect everybody, of course, right? So you'd think Teela would just eventually calm down and see reason, but no, she's just too headstrong, and she walks off, and everybody's betrayed me, nobody's looked out for me, I'm on my own, I can't trust anybody. And it's just so typical of what we see a lot of in entertainment today, the kind of younger character feeling that nobody can be trusting her overall, so she rebels and walks away. Just very cliche overall. And again, it just felt to me like Teela wasn't very likeable as a character. And I mentioned before in my previous review, throughout the series, she's very complacent, blaming everybody else. We see multiple times throughout the episodes where she's constantly rejecting Man-at-Arms offers of reconciliation. Even at the beginning, when she's going to receive her reward, she's very super confident. I deserve this. I've worked very hard. So there was a certain arrogance about her overall as a character. Now, there was no references to Teela's destiny as the sorceress. I did think they hint about it a couple of times. There's a couple of instances where Man-at-Arms goes to reveal something to Teela, and I think later on in the 5th episode, Adam also hints that he wants Teela to, or he wants to reveal something to Teela, and then they kind of cut off. And I think both of those instances were where they were going to reveal Teela that she was indeed destined to be the next sorceress overall. So maybe we will see that other revelation come forward in part 2. Now, we look at Teela, and obviously a lot of the other suggestions in terms of the outside controversy and speculation. Was she a Mary Sue? Was she overcompetent? Was she better than all the men and all the other characters? I'm not sure she was quite a Mary Sue, but it was close. You know, we see multiple scenes in the 2nd episode where she's taken on all of the guards at Triceps Fortress on her own, and then later on in episode 4 where she's up against Scareglow, I think it is, and basically we get that pose where she basically repels all of his spirits, and then she drags out the forge of the power sword as well. So even though she wasn't doing everything on her own, there was certainly that suggestion that, yeah, she was way more powerful. And again, if they tap into the lore that she's the sorceress, we can accept that to a degree, but the 80s version didn't do that. They never had Teela exhibit some sort of great magical strength, and I don't believe the 2002 reboot did either. There was an episode in the 2002 reboot where I think they tapped into Teela having visions of the future, but that was very sporadic, and she never had mastery of that ability overall. So again, they could have tapped further into that, but they didn't want to. And I also didn't like the current exchanges when she was talking down to Man-at-Arms. Even though he's her adopted father, he's still a dad. 1 minute she's calling him her dad, and the next minute she's calling him Duncan. I just didn't like that again. Again, just making Teela a very unlikable character in terms of my own personal opinion. Now, the next interesting element throughout this series was Triclops being presented as some sort of religious cult leader. We see this giving him this great speech in the 2nd episode where he's talking about the over-reliance of magic when he was under the rule of Skeletor. They had to constantly follow his foolhardy plans, but now that he's leader, he's going to lead this new age when we rely a lot more on technology rather than magic. So that was quite interesting. And then we do get, I think, what was very an intense scene where he takes one of his devotees and he basically transforms them into like a cybernetic being, and we see that quite vivid scene where one of their eyes pops out and it ends up being a cybernetic attachment, and then we see their arms turn into metal as well. So that was one of the scenes I pointed out in my non-spoiler review, that maybe not overly graphic, but there's something to be wary of, again, if you're making your kids watch this show. And that was quite an intense scene, and I think that was an interesting direction for Triclops. And really, Triclops could have been made the antagonist for this short story arc, but they never do that because he disappears after this, and I think he only comes back twice. In a further encounter when they take on Beastman and Man-at-Arms, and then he comes later on within the final episode when he makes another assault on Grayskull. So just a wasted opportunity, I think, in terms of Triclops overall. So now we go on to the main contentious point when we're talking about Teela and Andrea and their relationship. Now, just quickly, I think Andrea wasn't a very impactful character. Again, I'm not someone who supports these race changes just for the sake of it. I'm always an advocate of staying close to the source material, even though Andrea wasn't really a prominent character within the 80s version. But the main contention here is that some people have suggested that the series was queer baiting in terms of hinting in the relationship between the two. Now, okay, there are 1-2 lines of dialogue that, yes, do clearly indicate that they are in some sort of relationship, but I don't think that really mattered because it wasn't really critical to the overall story. You know, at the end of the day, we have to go on a search to forge the Sword of Power, so it doesn't really matter whether Teela or Andrea are together or not. Now, again, people are going to throw that this is one of the biggest examples of woke agenda and having two female characters in a lesbian relationship just to throw ahead representation, but it didn't matter in this show. It really didn't. They just didn't hint at it enough to be a big of an issue for me, so I don't think that was too much of a hindrance on whether you like the show or not. Now, the other issue that was raised here is that this series was primarily led by all females, and all of the iconic male characters were sidelined in favour of more focus on the female protagonist. And this is true for the most part. I have to admit, this is true. You know, we only see He-Man after the first episode in brief flashbacks. There's one scene that I think they released in a short clip where they take on Skeletor with Merman soldiers. And there's another scene where before they enter Triclops Fortress, Teela remembers where her and He-Man were working together to take on some forces. And He-Man doesn't appear again after that. So it's primarily the group of heroes throughout this journey is Evelyn, Teela, Andrea, Orko, Roboto, and Beastman. So none of the iconic male characters, no Mechanic, no Stratos, no Buzzoff, Fisto, none of them to be seen overall. So again, if you are coming at this more from a fan perspective, you'll be really disappointed, but a lot of the iconic male hero characters are nowhere to be seen. Now, they may make an appearance in part 2, and I think there were a couple of clips where we do see Teela leading the charge alongside Fisto, and I think it's Clampman as well. So I think that's going to be another flashback sequence because Teela's in the original armor gear that we saw from the beginning part of the story. So that'll be more of a flashback sequence that we see in the beginning part of part 2, I'm sure. But I think, again, from a fan perspective, just disappointing that we didn't see more male characters. And again, what made the 80s version so special is that it mixed the roles of both the male and female characters together. So He-Man was the lead, but you had very strong female characters with prominent roles throughout the series as well, and I think this series itself could have learned from that. Now, I did like the confrontation between Teela and Scareglow. This is, I believe, the 4th episode. Basically, he wants to get Teela to confront her fear, and if she does, in exchange, he'll hand her the half of the sword from the Subternia location. Now, I was right from my initial trailer review, because when we see the scenes when Teela is fighting off against a Dark He-Man, I thought it was either going to be He-Man under some sort of demonic influence, or that it was some sort of dream sequence or dark vision sequence. Now, a lot of people in the comments of that video pointed out that that was going to be the scene of Faker. Well, that turned out to be wrong, because Faker was at the beginning of the series, and this was actually a dark version of He-Man from a spiritual version. So this was essentially Teela's moment, like we got with Luke Skywalker, if you remember, in Empire Strikes Back, when he faces Vader in the cave, and that's him confronting his fear. So that was this was, and then she defeats Scarecrow, many sense. Now we then come on to the Orko scenes, and I think Orko is handled okay from a visual standpoint. He looked very good in his costume. And of course, in this version, he's far different from the upbeat childlike personality that we saw from the 80s version. Here, he's a lot more doubtful and introspective and self-reflective. We get those multiple scenes where he's really saying that he failed and he doesn't think he was good enough overall. So again, if you were coming about it from the fan perspective, you might be a bit disappointed because this is a much more of a deconstructive take on Orko. And to be honest, they took that approach with a lot of the characters, Man-at-Arms in particular, and Teela as well. As I mentioned before, characters with a far more cynical approach, a far more depressing approach. And, you know, it's sad to see, again, because you are calling this a continuation of the 80s version, just sad to see these characters just take a much more of a somber personality. But Orko, I think, had good interactions with Evil Lyn, and I think that was the best character dynamics of the whole entire season. When we see in episode 4 where they go to face their open fear, there is good conversations when they both reflect on how they were seen to be an overall perception. So Orko aligns to the fact that his original name wasn't Orko, it was meant to be Oracle, but it got mistaken for Orko, and Evil Lyn, turns out that she added the evil to her Lyn personality. So I liked this interaction between the two, and this is really when I think Evil Lyn was the best character, because we were showing hints of some sort of redemption, because we all know she starts off evil, and then through her interactions, in particular with Orko, we see a softer side. And I liked the force work and performance of Lena Headey here, again showing Evil Lyn building a good bond with Orko. So that carried a bit of weight when we see later on the very intense scene, I would see, where they finally get through to the end of Subeternia and they see the doorway open to Pre-Eternia. That was very much reminding me of Lord of the Rings, when Evil Lyn opens the door passage and we see the purple lighting, so similar to the scene in the Fellowship of the Ring with Gandalf. But then they find the passageway, and then Scarecrow comes back, and then Orko, in a really epic scene, finds him off. And I love the scene where we see the green smoke again, what we saw from the trailers, and Orbo is exhibiting these large yellow like fear, and he's trying to repel Scarecrow. Very good. And this is when he makes a sacrifice, and this was the controversy because Kevin Smith, for a reason I just cannot explain, deemed to spoil this scene in a recent interview online. I don't know why Kevin decided that. Again, I don't know why Kevin said a lot of things that he said throughout the review overall. But again, it was a bit depressing to see another fan favourite character die. I suppose maybe it worked in terms of the overall narrative, because again, you're raising the stakes that everybody's having to go out to end this quest, and it adds some sort of gravitas if some heroes fall as well. So in terms of the overall story, okay, I guess it worked, but again, just a bit depressing to see Orko bite the dust like that. Now, another point of contention surrounding all the drama was the race changing of King Grayskull to a black skin character. Now, King Grayskull was an original character created in the 2002 reboot, one of the best episodes, where we basically get a whole backstory towards how the original King Grayskull came to be and the power of the elders, and then he faced off against Horde. That epic episode, brilliant, and it's tragic that they didn't manage to follow on from that episode. So they took that character and make him a black skin character. So again, a lot of people took issue to this. We've gone through so many instances now. I haven't got the time to go through all of the examples where we're race changing, race swapping characters. But here, it just didn't matter really, because the Black King Grayskull, when they meet him in the 5th episode where they get to Pre-Eternia, it's not really that much of a substantial character. We just hint at other versions of characters from the toy line, and they're living in this safe haven in heaven. But he wasn't much of a character. So my point was, what was the point of changing his race? Did it matter? I mean, did you really have to include him? Again, bad use of the character, where the 2002 made such a great use. This was such a superfluous use. It didn't matter. So again, it comes from what perspective you're standing. Are you really angry enough about the race change of this character that you're going to hold it against the show? Are you really indifferent? I'm probably indifferent because the character didn't really go anywhere. Neither did this detour really into Britannia. I think it was just kind of stalling for time, and also they had to get Adam back into the mix in order to keep He-Man out there. This then leads us to the whole cliffhanger. So they forged the sword of power in another great visual sequence where we see Roboto forging a sword. This results in him dying as well. Why have we got to do that? I don't know. Again, just trying to add more weight to it. Unnecessary in my opinion, but we forge the Sword of Power, we come to Grayskull, and again, very short sequence here where we just thrust into attack, where we get the last appearance of Triclops, and he's attacking Castle Grayskull. We get to the Chambers of Grayskull and the Hall of Wisdom, and Adam wields the sword, goes to transform, and just as he goes to say the line, "I have the power," all of a sudden we see him get stabbed in the back by Skeletor. Again, in one of the most violent scenes throughout the series, and it was a very shocking moment when you're watching it for the first time. Skeletor manages to manifest himself out of Evil Lynn's staff and stab Adam, and basically he was just keeping it, the essence of his spirit, following the beginning part of the series. So it grips you at the time. It's very shocking and it's quite a violent scene. And then Skeletor manifests into a more powerful being, basically a He-Man version of himself. And okay, that was quite dramatic, but I didn't like the end shot when basically he towers over the Castle of Grayskull. That just felt a bit hokey, and all of a sudden we cut to credits. I wish they just did it better, just to give it much more of a sense of menace and purpose about it. Now, again, this is controversial because if you follow the background, a lot of people alluded to this because back when we got hints of a cataclysmic events that saw He-Man disappeared as such, people were drawing on the toy line. Now, there is a toy line figure of Skeletor as this more evil, more physical form where he's got the H symbol on his chest. So a lot of people were already suspicious of the fact that we're going to see at some stage Skeletor inhabit the power of He-Man, take the power of He-Man, and then that's why he's got this overall design. So again, that's been proven to be correct. You know, he does that in the final scene overall. So again, that's going to have a lot of people bemoaning and hating the change of direction that he took with this character overall. So in terms of the entire series, that's all of the spoiler highlights that are really brought to my attention when watching this overall series. Now, just to give some quick commentary again, as we all know, the background behind this whole controversy or drama online, they announced the synopsis, people raised the eyebrow that Teela, it was up to her to restore the Sword of Power. Later on, Cloudfish put out a tweet about it all being about Teela. Kevin Smith's response, that then stokes all the fire and the drama, and then he keeps making his other tweets. We learned the fact that he said he was a huge fan of the property in 1982, but the property wasn't released until 1983. Now, do we really care about this? Now, I don't really care because I'm able to detach myself and focus on the individual products themselves. But as is the way with the internet and social media, people do get caught up in the drama, and without criticizing too much, I think a lot of people are more invested in the exterior drama rather than the actual show itself. I don't think they really care about He-Man. They're not really fans of the project, and you don't have to like He-Man if you don't want to. But where I see multiple videos being made about certain quotes and certain reviews, there was one about IGN, when again they were very culpable in triggering people and putting in big bright letters, "This is Teela's show." And yes, it is Teela's show, as I mentioned in the non-spoiler review. But again, just getting too much involved in the drama and not actually critiquing the show. You know, I'm seeing too much of that online, but in this case, a lot of people's suspicions, they are warranted. Yes, it is Teela's show. Yes, there are hints, if you like, of woke politics or social agendas. Yes, there is a feminist drive by doing away a lot of the male characters. Yes, we are doing a darker, deconstructive take on these certain characters I mentioned before. This is basically like an Injustice storyline of the He-Man universe. So in terms of this project, yes, all of the concerns are warranted, and I think it's a shame because there was a real potential here to have an epic He-Man animated series, especially if what you're going by the first 15 minutes of the show, and I just wish it just stuck to that narrative and just built on that more, because you could have had Teela be a pivotal character and still kept He-Man as the focus. All of this drama and commentary, it really is unnecessary. And of course, being a YouTuber and you have to follow the certain trends, it does get a bit tiring after a while, just seeing every other notification, Kevin Smith's a liar, Kevin Smith betrayed us. But just focus and review the content and you'll find that it's not a bad show, it's not a terrible show. There are issues with the story, as I mentioned before, but it's an entertaining, action-packed show that you can enjoy. And again, I think the real disappointment is coming more from a fan perspective in terms of the handling of this franchise and the handling of these characters. And I just wish they just treated this much more as an Elseworld alternative rather than a sequel or a continuation. Because as I mentioned in my non-spoiler review, this is not a sequel, this is not a contention, this is its own thing, and it would have been better served of. In actual fact, I would have preferred if they continued the 2002 reboot, because that was fantastic. I may do a review of that if I've got time later on, but that is the real reboot that of He-Man really should have deserved a further continuation of, and I wish that they'd just done that overall in the forefront as well. So that's it really. That's my overall spoiler commentary. I've covered the main aspects of the episode. I've talked about the various drama perceptions from a fan and also from the outside point of view from Kevin Smith and all of his various statements. So that's it overall in terms of my spoiler review of Masters of the Universe Revelation Part 1. We'll see what happens in Part 2. Hopefully there will be some sort of reset. Of course, He-Man will get the Sword of Power again at some point, and I think we'll get an epic battle against Skeletor overall, I'm sure, in the long run as well. So let me know what you think in the comments below. Please also hit those like and subscription buttons and help me provide you with more high quality content like this in the long term. But that's it for now. Take care of yourselves, stay at safe distances, and I will see you very, very soon.